It sounds kind of boring, doesn't it?
Yeah, but now it's not.
They are not boring. And what's happening in the last few weeks is not boring either. I think now it's up today, but when we were putting the story to bed last night, the shares had fallen 70% just this year, and we're not that far into 2024. So I think that there's a temptation that I have as a journalist. Maybe all reporters have this, to like be able to give a kind of, not a facile answer, but a simple answer. It'd be so nice. Reporting would be so much better if I could just be like, answer that in like 5 words. But the reality is, this is a story that has to do with ambition, has to do with the sort of the small wanting to get big and the big wanting to get bigger. And it's a story that has to do with regulation and regulators and the rules that govern banking and real estate. And it's a story about my first beat in journalism, Manhattan apartments. You cannot tell the story of what has happened here at New York Community Bank without telling the story of real estate. So it's got these kind of 3 vectors, and I hope people read the story, because I think we did a fun job with my editor, David Shear, of kind of trying to create trying to paint a picture, create a portrait.
And Max, this is a company that grew tremendously through deals. Just looking at one of your paragraphs, 2004, they cobbled together 7 banks into the 3rd biggest thrift in the U.S. As it hit $23 billion of assets, up from $1.9 billion in 3 years.
Yeah.
So how did we get from 2000 to 04 to now in 2024?
Yep. They really had a game plan. And the game plan was to, gobble up rivals, essentially keep their personalities. It's not like everything became New York Community Bank. And then they would take the mom and pop depositor money, and they would really just loan it out to Manhattan real estate, and one kind of real estate in particular, which is rent stabilized, rent regulated. And for a long time that's a good business to be in. It was a good business to be in. It's like, I don't know if you have you were just saying that Flagstar owns your house, but if you lived in a rent stabilized apartment, I mean, by and large, you're made in the shade. You do not want to leave that apartment. You're going to stay there. It's going to be stable earnings. Cash is going to keep flowing. But what happened though is 2 things. Rent regulations changed in 2019, right before COVID started emptying Manhattan. So real estate all of a sudden under pressure. New York Community Bank also keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. They do a $10 billion deal, a couple $1 billion. They want to get even bigger, and apparently it seems that regulators may have put a kibosh on it. Then Flagstar. They buy Flagstar. They even buy, you may remember, Signature Bank, a part of Signature Bank. Yep. All of a sudden, they cross over $100 billion. And you know what happens then? Regulators start looking at you in a new way. And their capital did not measure up to rivals.
Now, with hindsight, why didn't they recognize that? Or did they recognize it and chose not to deal with it? What kind of happened there?
Okay, I'll tell you some inside baseball about this. So after Flagstar and New York Community Bank announced their deal, the regulatory approval that they need, and this is going to sound boring, but I promise it will not be boring. The regulatory approval that they're going to need is going to come from a regulator called the FDIC. Time goes by. They seem to not be getting that approval. And they say, guess what, everyone? When our deal is approved, we're going to go from being a thrift to being essentially a nationally chartered bank. And lo and behold, guess what that means? You know what? We don't need the FDIC's approval anymore. We're just going to take the OCC's approval, thank you very much. And we found nonprofit groups complaining and being like, what is the deal with this? How are they allowed to, it's essentially called regulatory arbitrage. It's the mean knock on it is kind of shopping for regulators. Whether or not that happened, what did happen is that the OCC eventually approved it, and they said, we're going to let this go, but we get to control your dividends if you want to boost your dividends. And one of the things that knocked all of this mayhem into action is that New York Community Bank a few weeks ago said, we're cutting our dividend. So all these pieces fit together into a portrait of a bank that got really big, was really big in real estate, and those 2 major parts of its game plan kind of contained the seeds of this chaos that we're seeing right now.
Well, and Max, a year ago and change, we had the issue with SVB. We had the issue with Signature Bank, First Republic. Similarities, differences with where New York Community is now compared to kind of the flurry of bank failures we had?
I hope he's not listening. I want to steal something that Mike Moore, who sits next to me and is my boss and one of my editors, said to me. One of the things that happened with First Republic and even with Signature was like things that were already going down. There were problems that could be visible to anyone who opened up the books. The difference with New York Community Bank is the problems are in a way about the future. What everyone is afraid of right now when it comes to banks and real estate is that loans are going to sour. I mean, we're in an office tower right now. You know, the landscape of offices in New York has changed. I think people are really worried that there's going to be a kind of reckoning coming. And that reckoning is not just going to mess with the real estate industry, it's going to mess with the banks that lend to it. And I think there's a fear that that New York Community Bank, which is already shocked investors by saying, listen, we're going to have to set aside $500 million in loan loss reserves. I think there's a lot of concern. They're going to have to set aside even more. And so in some ways, maybe one accurate way of describing what's going on now is a kind of not just anxiety about the current moment, but an anxiety about what the future will hold here in New York City.